everybody, it's Courtney. Today I am going to be creating a card with the Punny Farm Goats by Miss Ink Stamps, and I'm very excited to be part of the new design team. So I'm going to create a one-layer scene here, and I'm going to kind of walk you through the process. I knew I wanted to create a farm-like scene, so I know I want to draw out a barn. And I'm not artistic, I've said this before, so I draw everything with a pencil, and most of the time I have my T-square ruler because I just don't trust myself. I started by lining up that little chicken or rooster or whatever they are, stamp so that I could create a little opening in the barn big enough for her to be sitting on or sitting in, I guess, and then just kind of sketching everything out with my pencil. It may not be perfect, but it will give me a good guide before I go in with my pen and make anything permanent. And before I start all of my coloring, I'll end up erasing these lines anyway. This is just so that I don't make a mistake and make it where I can't fix it. So once that was done, I'm going to go ahead and line up my masks, which I didn't end up using, but it was a good idea to have them for placement. And then I'll start by stamping, or I'll go ahead and stamp my images. And I am using Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. I went ahead and stamped out this little, I think it might be a hen, I think that's what you call it, in this little opening of the barn with the hay kind of sticking out of the opening a little bit. And then I'll go ahead and start stamping out my little goats. Now there's 4 little goats in this stamp set, and I just didn't have enough room to fit all 4 of them. However, I would have liked to. I love goats. I want one. So when I saw this stamp set, I had to have it. I'm also going to stamp out some of the little chickens, or the little baby chicks, I guess, in the stamp set as well. And you can certainly mask and kind of stamp behind or over each other, but I just figured I would keep it nice and simple and not do any masking at all. Therefore, I won't be doing any ink blending in the background. I'm going to do my entire background with the Copics, but keep it really, really simple. So I'm going to stamp out, like I said, these little baby chicks, and I'm going to have this little one that is kind of bending over with his little bottom sticking in the air, which is so cute. And I'm going to stamp out some of the little additional items, I guess, the little can and the little sock that the goats would be playing with. And then I'm going to go ahead and go directly over where I had my pencil lines to make my scene a little bit more permanent at this point. So I'm going to be using an EK Success journaling pen, which is a Copic safe pen. I got this idea from Kelly Letavola because it's a lot cheaper than the Copic multi-liners, which you can certainly use as long as it's a Copic safe pen. So again, I'm bringing out my T-square ruler, and I'm going to go directly over the lines, fix up any areas that maybe weren't completely even. Now's my chance to go ahead and even those out and make this a little bit more concrete. I am making sure that I'm careful that I don't go directly over my images that I have already stamped out. And then once my barn is completely outlined, I'm going to go ahead and also create a fence in the background. I was originally going to put a fence in the front, but I didn't want to take away too much of my actual little goats there. So I'm going to create a little wavy line with my pencil first to kind of just as a guide as to where I want to put my fence. And then I'm just putting little rectangles in all kind of funky shapes. They're not even, they're not meant to be. And once that I've reached the end there, I'm just going to draw a wavy line in the same shape as I had with my pencil line to make that complete the little fence there. So I had a little bit of open space there. I wasn't sure how much open space I was going to have, so I ended up stamping a few of the other items there. I'm going to stamp another little chick that's kind of bending over, and then this little boot that that the goats would be playing with or biting on or whatever they do. So once my scene was all drawn out, I'm going to go ahead and erase those pencil lines before I start my coloring. Once you do color over, you will not be able to erase them. So make sure all of your pencil lines are completely erased before you move on to the coloring. So I always like to start with my background. That way I don't have to worry about going over my images or around my images. I do have to worry about it, but I don't have to be as careful. Let's just put it that way. So I'm going to start off with this guy, and I'm not doing any blending at all here. I'm keeping this nice and simple, like I said. I am going around those little fence posts there and then just extending that over all the way up to the top of the card panel. You may have to go over it twice if you have some streaky lines, which sometimes you tend to get with any alcohol marker. Just go over it twice and that should erase those. Just make sure that your marker is nice and inked up. So for the grass, I'm going to speed this up because I made a lot of errors with this, so it took me a little bit of time. I am going to start by covering up the entire area with my lightest color, which is a G21, and I am going around my images the best I can. I will take a colorless blender later and fix up any areas that I may have gotten a little bit too messy. Now I did remove the other end of the cap because I just refilled this marker and it was getting a little blobby. More ink was coming out than I really wanted to. So in order to prevent that, I just removed the other cap. Next, this is a G46. I know the cap fell over, but I am just creating a shadow underneath each one of these little objects and characters. And then I'm going to blend, or here's where I made some flick lines for grass. And I just did this in the front and I hated it immediately. So I'm blending this out with a G24 and trying to add even more blades of grass, as well as a little hill that I should have put a little bit closer to this little goat because I wanted him to be standing on a hill. But again, we'll fix that later. Next, I'm going to be adding some shading towards the back because this will kind of make it look like it's more in the background if it's a little darker. So this is the darkest color. This is G28, and I'm just going along those lines of the fence and then flicking down. And I'm only using flick lines to make my blending a little bit easier. That's totally optional. Next, going in with that G46 and blending that out, that G28 a little bit, then that G24, and then finally finishing off with the G21 again, just to make sure that I have more of a seamless blend. Now, because the G21 is such a light color, I can go over certain areas and kind of lighten them up, which I tried to do with the grass. Then I tried to add more blades of grass and tone it down, and I was just hating it more and more each time. So I decided to darken up the shadows by using the G28 and then blending that out with the G46 and the G24. And then decided to use that G21 almost like a colorless blender. So the areas that I wasn't happy with, I'm going to significantly lighten them up by going over them several times with the G21. Remember that the lighter the marker is, the more colorless blender it has in it. That's really not, that may not be true, but that's the way I think of it. So the lighter colors will remove the darker colors. So that's what I did to remove that hill, or at least lighten it up, as well as those blades of grass. You can still see them lightly, but they're not nearly as noticeable. I took my colorless blender to fix up any of the coloring errors that I went over my images with, and then we'll move on to the coloring of the barn. So I'm going to start by coloring the inside of this little opening where my hen is, and I want this to be almost black, as if it's kind of the opening of the barn. So I'm going to cover up the entire area with my C3, which is my lightest color, just to get the paper saturated, to get my colors to blend easier. And then I'm just going to be doing a little shading with my C7 off to the left-hand side, and then blending that out a little bit with the C5, and then finally finishing off to the right-hand side with that C3 again, just making sure that my grays really blend well together. And this way it'll appear that it is open in the back, but there's a little bit of light kind of casting inside of the, I guess it wouldn't be casting, but going inside of the barn. So for the roof as well as the frame of my barn door here, I'm going to be using some E20 markers, again, going in with that lightest color just to get the paper saturated. And then I'm just going to be adding some shading for the roof where it's kind of like in sections. I'm just going to be adding it to the bottom portion of each of those sections, I guess. And then for the door frame, it's going to be mainly off to the left-hand side and where the little X or whatever it is, I guess it would be an X, where it kind of meets. I'm blending that out a little bit with my darkest mid-tone here, and I'm just going to end up leaving a very, very small highlight for that E21 because I want these to be fairly dark or like a mid brown or medium brown. So I don't want to add too much of the E21, but you do want to still maintain a highlight. So just like I always say to use those scary darks to get the contrast, it's just as important to use a significantly lighter color than what you're going for as well to make sure that you have that highlight. Now I also added a little bit of shading off to the right-hand side where that top of the X meets the frame, I guess, just because it was looking a little bit too light. There was no contrast there at all. So I just took one of my midtones, so it wasn't too dark, but I still have a little bit of contrast. For the rest of the door, or the inside of the door, I guess. Oh, well, first I did the hay, and I'm only using 2 colors here just to add a little bit of color, but I'm not really too concerned about the shading. It's not a really major part of the scene. So now we'll move on to the door itself, and I'm going to switch over to some E50 markers, and I'm going to start by taking my E50 and I'm going to cover up the entire area. Like always, the more saturated the paper is, the better your colors are going to blend, as long as it's not oversaturated where you're going to have some bleeding. And I'm not going to do really wood grain, but I'm going to give this some texture. So I'm going to use kind of the wood grain technique just to give it some texture. So I'm going to add some shading, and this is my darkest mid-tone first. So I'm going to add some shading in the corners, I guess you could say. And this is just kind of random, to be honest with you. If I can't tell where the shadows are supposed to be, nobody else is going to either. So as long as there's contrast, I'm not too concerned about it. I'm doing little squiggly lines with just the very tip of my marker to just add some texture. And then I'm going to take the E59 and I'm going to add those same squiggly lines just in the very darkest area. So where I put that shading with the E57. Then I'm going to blend those areas out with the E55 and then add even more squiggly lines to kind of get a little bit of variation within the texture, I guess. I guess it kind of looks like wood grain, but that's not necessarily what I was going for. And then finally, I will go back in with that E53 and I'm going to cover up this entire area again. And these colors will kind of, or these squiggly lines will kind of smooth out a little bit, but you'll still have that texture that you're looking for. Next, I am going to move on to the barn itself, and I'm going to speed this up even more because this took a little bit of time. I'm going to start off again with my lightest color first to map out the darkest areas, which I'm glad I did because I ended up changing my mind as far as where my shadows would be. I was initially going to put a shadow above the door and then decided against it. But I am going in with my darkest color now, adding shading to the left-hand side of the barn, underneath the roof, and then underneath the little opening where that little hen is. Going in with my mid-tone or my darkest mid-tone here, and this is kind of like a reddish brown, but it's certainly not red enough. So I'm pretty much just doing my shading with my E markers to get my contrast first, and then I'll go over it, over the entire thing with more of a reddish tone to bring that red out a little bit more. It just wasn't red enough for me. So I'm finishing off with the lightest color here, which is that E13, just getting these colors to blend a little bit. And then I'm going to go in with the R22. And like I said, I'm going to go over the entire thing to kind of make this a little bit more red than brown. And I just picked a little bit too light of a color. And I knew it right when I started it, but I wanted everything to be consistent. So I finished covering up the entire thing. And then I'm going to bring out a little bit darker, but it's not a really dark or really bright red. If you go over it with too dark of a color, you're going to lose all of your shading, and it's going to kind of defeat the whole purpose of putting those E markers down. But the R05 seemed to brighten everything up, give it that reddish tone, but still maintain that shading. So next, again, I'm going to take my colorless blender to kind of fix up some areas where I had gone over my images a little bit. or I had some bleeding just because of the amount of ink that I put down. Now, before you use your colorless blender, you want to make sure that that ink is dry. And before you color over the areas that you use your colorless blender, you want to make sure it's dry. And you know that it's dry when it's no longer cool. If it's cold to the touch, it's not dry yet. So next we're going to move on to the hen, and I wanted her to be white. So I'm just going to add a teeny tiny amount of shading with the C5, and I'm using it very sparingly, being I used it in the background. Then I'm going to flick that color out a little bit with the C3 and then with the C1, still leaving some white space, but you won't even be able to tell that I used the same color as I did for the opening once you get everything blended. I do quickly go over it with my colorless blender to get rid of those flick lines so that I have a little bit more of a seamless blend. For the little top portion of her head, I don't know what this is called, I'm just going to go in solid with a red. There's not enough room to do any shading here. So next I'm going to move on to the little chicks, and I'm only using a 3-color blend for these because they are super tiny. So I'm going to go in first with that lightest color again to get that paper saturated, and I'm concentrating at this point just a center highlight to make my life a little bit more easier. And for the shape of these little chicks, it was just easier to do that. So I'm placing a little bit of shading on either side of their little faces or his little bottom there that's sticking up, and then blending that out with the E35 and then going back in with that E11 just to get those colors to blend. I brought back out that, I'm sorry, I think I said E, I meant Y. I brought back out that Y38, which is still a yellow, but to me, it's a little bit more orange. So I use that for their little beaks. And again, it's like one little dot. So I wouldn't worry too much or even try to do any shading with this. So I brought out my C markers again for this little can as well as the sock. And I started with just the C3 and C1. And for the can, I'm just doing a little shading on either side because it's a round object. For the sock, I'm just adding a little bit of shading towards the bottom where it's touching the ground. And then I ended up bringing in the C5 just because the can wasn't quite dark enough. This is normally a gray object anyway, so you want to use a little bit darker of colors where the sock would normally be white. So you're just adding the shading. For the little toe and the heel of the sock, I'm just going to go in with a red. Nope, first I did the boot, sorry. So I'm going to bring back out those E50 markers to add some color to the boot, and I'm just concentrating the shading being off to the left-hand side, and where the toe of the boot, there's a little flick line within the illustration, just using that as my guide to put a little bit of a flick line to add a little bit of shading that adds a little bit of dimension to that toe area. Now for the heel and the toe of the sock, I went in with a red and realized that I did need a little bit of shading here. So I went in with the R29 just to add a little bit of shading to the bottom part, just to have a little bit of variation. Totally optional, like I said. So for the fence in the background, I'm going to bring out those E50s again, and you can see that I'm using some of the same color combinations. I do this on purpose just to kind of have some consistency within my card. So I'm going to cover up each of the little fence posts with my E55. Then I'm going to bring out the E59, and I'm just adding some flick lines from the base of each of the posts up, just to make sure that the top portion of the posts have more of the highlight, because if I drew a sun, this would be where the light of the sun would hit. So that would be your lightest area. Once the E59 was down, I'm going to take that E57 and flick that up a little bit further, just leaving the very top of the little posts for that E55. And you can see that I wasn't very careful, especially with that E59. So again, like I said, using those lighter colors as a colorless blender is always an option. So I'm going to bring out that B00 again that I used in the sky, and I'm going to go directly over those areas that I was a little messy and went out of those lines that I had drawn, and that will pretty much remove that brown. It's acting as if it's a colorless blender, but it's not taking away that blue. It's just adding a little bit more blue. So I find that this is the easiest way to go. I also did accidentally touch a little bit of that brown and dragged that up in my sky. Just went over it several times with that B00 and it took it right up. So next, moving on to the goats. I'm going to only show you one in this speed, I guess, and then I'll speed it up just to show you where I put my shading and the color combinations. So again, using a center light source, starting off with my lightest color to map out those darkest areas, which will be on either side of his face and where his little furry part on his chest. I'm sure there's a technical term for that as well. That would also cast a shadow where his back legs are kind of behind his front legs. That would also cast a shadow. And then I'm just going to put a little shading on the inside of both of his front legs so that I don't have two dark areas touching. Also added a little bit of shading above his nose just to give a little shape, or a little bit more shape, to his little face. Blending this area out with my C5. And for the most part, I think I used a 3-color blend on the goats. I may have used a 4-color blend on one of them, but we'll see in a minute. So once my C5 was down, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the C3, and I'm just going to get these areas to blend a little bit further. Also going to use this C3 for the inside of his little ears and that little furry part on his little chest that I wanted to appear white or a lot lighter than the rest of his body. So just adding the shading with the C3 and blending that out with the C1. Same with his little, I don't think they're antlers, horns, I guess. Whatever. You guys know what I mean. So like I said, once, I did his little hooves. I added black and a C7 and C5 just so that it's a little bit darker than the rest of his body, so it stands out from the furry part. So I'm going to move on to the other 2 goats here, and I'm going to speed this up a little bit just so that you can see where I put my shadows. Each one of these are in kind of a different position, and I did use a different color combination for each one of them. For this one, he's going to have some shading where his 2 of his legs are behind the other 2, I guess. And underneath his little chin and where his little belly is, there's some lines within the illustration. Again, use those to your advantage to guide you as to where your shading should be. So just blending that out, I also added a little bit of shading above his little nose as well, just to add a little bit extra shape, I guess. I did have to refill my E31. I just wasn't getting a good blend. Usually that's because your marker's a little dry. So don't try to continue to blend it if it's not working. Make sure you refill your marker. If you don't have a refill, move on to a different color because you will ruin the nib. And now you have to buy a refill and a nib. So moving on to this final goat here, using a different color combination. His shading is going to be again on either side of his face, where his little back leg there is kind of bent, and on the base, because he's laying on the ground, it would be pretty much on the bottom of his body. Blending that out each time. Now I did use a 4-color blend on this one just because the E13 and E11 are so similar to one another that I felt like I needed to bring something else in. So I did end up bringing that E15 for my darkest color just to make sure that I did have my contrast there. So filled in their little horns there just to add a little bit of color to them. Again, teeny tiny area, so I'm not overly concerned. Added a little bit of color to their cheeks, which honestly you probably can't even see, especially being significantly lighter than the rest of their body. So again, it acted as a colorless blender. So just going to finish off with a couple white gel pen details, which I kind of debated on. You can see me kind of moving around, scared to add them, but I did add a few to most of the goats and the little cans and a couple other things. And last, to finish out the card, I am going to go ahead and stamp my sentiment right there in that little teeny tiny area that we actually have for a sentiment with Simon Says Stamp Black Dye ink. That is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.